Welcome to this first module in the software engineering course, which is on the topic of requirements engineering. So as you can see, this term consists of two words, requirements and engineering. So it's some kind of engineering practice, doing things systematically with high quality. But the core thing we look at is requirements. A requirement is defined as what we call a stakeholder need. And again, there are two terms here that are important. First of all, we have stakeholders, and those are all the people, entities, organizations that somehow have a stake and interest in our product. So this might be a client who pays for your product, it might be the end users or other kinds of users, it might be competitors, regulators, so a lot of different kinds of stakeholders that you might want to consider. So all of these play a role, all of these have an interest in your product, and all of these are parts that you need to consider when you come up with your requirements for your system. And these stakeholders, they have needs. And this is a really, really important part of requirements, to understand that we don't want to learn what a user, a customer, a stakeholder wants, but what they actually need. And this is part of what makes the practice of requirements engineering really difficult, because a lot of people, when you ask them, they might be able to tell you what they want, but it's really hard to figure out what they actually need. So they might tell you a lot of things that they don't need, so you have to separate that somehow and come up with the things that are necessary for your product. So this is what it's all about. We want to figure them out, and it's really a discovery. It's not that you just ask people, but you need to put a lot of effort into finding out what the stakeholder needs are for any given software product. Now, there are lots of different ways of distinguishing requirements. A very common one is to look at system versus user requirements. So the user requirements are really the needs of the end users of your system. So for example, if you're talking about a car, you could say you want to have voice control to control the radio in your car. So this is a typical end user requirement, but on a system level, to enable that, to enable voice control to switch on the radio, you might need lots of smaller detailed things that are on a much more technical level. And very often you make this distinction that you say, what are the things that the end user requires, the end user needs, and what's the consequence for our system development? What do we need to come up? What kind of technical capabilities do we need? And so on. Another distinction that we often make is between what we call functional requirements and the so-called non-functional requirements, or often also called quality requirements. So functional requirements describe what the system shall do. So things like the system shall have voice control to enable the radio. The non-functional requirements are really the qualities. For example, how performant should it be? How maintainable should it be? Should it be supported on different operating systems or different hardware or things like that? So this is often a very important distinction. And again, the non-functional requirements, we'll look into that later, but they might be a lot harder to specify. For example, how quick should a response be to a voice control in a car? And this is an important distinction. And there are a few more, but these are very often the very high level and very important parts we look at. And then within requirements engineering, we look at 4 different practices, 4 different activities that are important. And these are the requirements elicitation, the requirements specification, requirements validation, and finally requirements management. All this together is requirements engineering. And in elicitation, we try to discover, we try to find out what the stakeholder needs are. We then somehow specify them, we write them down, we validate them, we make sure they're actually appropriate and correct. And finally, we often have to manage them, for example, deal with change or look at how they relate to each other, how they're interdependent, and so on. Now, these 4 activities are written down here like they come in a sequential order, but it can be very intertwined. For example, you might already have something written down from a previous system. There is already something specified, but you realize something is missing, so you have to go back to elicitation. Or while you validate, you realize something is missing, you go back to the specification. So this is not a sequential process. This can happen in any order. And this also depends a lot on how you develop your software, how the process looks like. Now, in the remaining videos in this module, we will look into each of these activities in more detail and describe what is necessary, what is problematic in those different activities.